There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over an operating room in the hour before dawn. Not silence exactly, because the machines still hum their steady rhythms, and somewhere a monitor beeps its patient reminder that a heart is still beating, but a stillness nonetheless. The sense of a room holding its breath between one crisis and the whatever comes next. Angela Whitmore had worked as a scrub nurse at Sacred Heart Regional Hospital for nearly 22 years, and in all that time, she had come to understand that stillness, the way a farmer understands weather and not something to be feared, but something to be read carefully, its smallest changes carrying meaning that a less attentive person might miss entirely. She was 51 years old that winter, her close-cropped hair beginning to silver at the temples, her hands steady in the particular way that comes only from decades of exacting, careful work. She had trained 3 generations of young surgeons in the quiet, unspoken art of the operating room, not the technical skill of cutting and suturing, which the medical schools handled well enough on their own, but the deeper rhythm of surgery, the sense of when a room was going smoothly and when something, somewhere, had begun to quietly go wrong. She rarely spoke of her own history. Most of her colleagues assumed, reasonably enough, that Angela had simply spent her whole career as a scrub nurse, moving steadily up through Sacred Heart's ranks the way most nurses did. What almost none of them knew, what she had kept quietly to herself for reasons that made sense only to her, was that Angela Whitmore had once been something else entirely, in a different life, in a different country, under circumstances she had left behind long ago and rarely revisited, even in her own private thoughts. The night that would finally reveal the truth of who she was began, as so many difficult nights in a hospital do, with an ordinary problem that grew, gradually and then all at once, into something far larger than anyone in that operating room had been prepared for. A highway accident on the interstate outside town, a jackknifed truck, an overturned passenger van, the particular chaos of a multi-vehicle collision on icy roads. In the dead of January, I'd had sent 5 patients to Sacred Heart's emergency department within the same 20-minute window, each of them requiring immediate surgical attention, each of them bleeding internally in ways that could not wait for the careful, orderly sequence that hospitals preferred whenever circumstances allowed. Dr. Peter Cavanaugh, the young surgeon on call that night, was talented, well-trained, and only 4 years out of his residency, capable enough for the ordinary emergencies that made up the bulk of Sacred Heart's surgical caseload, but not yet seasoned by the particular chaos of a true mass casualty event, the kind where the usual rules of orderly, sequential care simply did not apply. He moved into the first surgery with careful competence, addressing a ruptured spleen in a middle-aged man named Harold Denning, and Angela took her position beside him as she always did, her hands anticipating his needs before he had fully voiced them. The quiet choreography of 22 years of practiced partnership, settling naturally into place. But even as they worked on Harold Denning, word filtered in from the emergency department that the other 4 patients, 2 young women, an elderly man, and a teenage boy, were all deteriorating, faster than the department's limited overnight surgical staff could reasonably manage. There was only 1 surgeon on call. There were 5 patients who could not wait. It was in that moment, as Dr. Cavanaugh, sweat beginning to bead at his temples, despite the operating room's careful chill, glanced up from Harold, Denning's open abdomen with the particular panic of a competent man, realizing the scope of a crisis exceeded his training, that Angela Whitmore made a decision that would, within the hour, upend everything her colleagues believed they understood about the quiet, unassuming scrub nurse who had stood beside them for over 2 decades. "Dr. Cavanaugh," she said, her voice carrying the same calm, measured steadiness it always did. "The bleeding in his spleen is more extensive than the imaging suggested. You're going to need to work faster than you're currently moving, or we'll lose him before you're finished, and there won't be time to help the others waiting." Cavanaugh, startled, glanced up at her. "I'm moving as fast as I safely can, Angela." "I understand," she said, "but I need you to trust me on something. There's a secondary bleed near the splenic artery that the imaging didn't catch. If you don't address it in the next few minutes, this surgery will take twice as long as it needs to, and 4 other patients are running out of time waiting on you." There was a brief pause, the particular hesitation of a trained surgeon weighing the input of a nurse against his own careful assessment. And then, because some part of him recognized, even in his exhaustion, that Angela Whitmore's instincts had never once failed him across 4 years of working together, he adjusted his approach exactly as she'd suggested. She was right. The secondary bleed, hidden just behind the primary injury, would have cost them precious additional time had it gone unaddressed. With Angela's guidance, the surgery that might have taken 90 minutes was completed in just over an hour, Harold Denning's condition stabilizing steadily as they closed. It was what happened next, however, that truly changed the course of that long winter night. As the surgical team began preparing to transfer Harold Denning to recovery, word came through that the second patient, one of the young women from the highway accident, a college student named Rachel Ferris, had begun crashing rapidly in the emergency department, her internal bleeding accelerating faster than the department's stabilization efforts could manage. The single available anesthesiologist was still occupied, finishing paperwork from Harold's surgery. The hospital's overnight staffing, thin even under ordinary circumstances, simply could not produce a second qualified surgical team fast enough. It was in that gap, that dangerous, narrowing window between what the hospital's protocols technically allowed and what 5 critically injured patients actually needed, that Angela Whitmore did something that no one at Sacred Heart Regional had ever seen her do in over 2 decades of quiet, careful service. She scrubbed in as lead, not as assistant, and began stabilizing Rachel Ferris herself. "Angela, what are you doing?" Dr. Kavanaugh said, entering the second operating room moments later, his voice sharp with a mixture of alarm and confusion as he found his scrub nurse, of 4 years standing where a surgeon should stand, scalpel in hand, already working with the swift, practiced confidence of someone who had clearly done this exact kind of work many times before, in circumstances far more desperate than a well-equipped American hospital. "Saving her life," Angela said without looking up, her hands moving with a precision that made the surrounding nurses, several of whom had frozen in place, uncertain how to respond to a scrub nurse operating so far outside the boundaries of her official role, exchange bewildered glances with one another. "She's got maybe 10 minutes before this becomes unsurvivable, and there's nobody else in this building right now qualified to stop it. Scrub in and assist or step back and let me finish. Either way, I'm not stopping." Kavanaugh stood frozen for a long moment, torn between the deeply ingrained instinct to enforce hospital protocol and the plain, undeniable evidence in front of him that whatever Angela Whitmore was doing, she was doing it with the steady, exacting skill of someone who had performed this exact kind of emergency surgery countless times before. "Who taught you to do this?" he asked, even as his hands, almost against his own better judgment, began moving to assist her. "There will be time for that conversation later," Angela said calmly. "Right now, I need you focused on the artery, not on my resume." What Peter Kavanaugh did not yet know, what would only emerge slowly, over the following hours, as the full truth of that long winter night finally came to light, was that Angela Whitmore had not always been a scrub nurse. 25 years earlier, in a war-torn region of West Africa where she had volunteered as a young trauma surgeon, straight out of her residency, Angela had spent 3 grueling years operating in field conditions that made even a chaotic American emergency room look, by comparison, almost luxuriously equipped. She had performed hundreds of emergency surgeries in tents lit by generator power, with supplies rationed by necessity rather than convenience, learning to trust her hands and her instincts in circumstances where hesitation cost lives far more often and far more immediately than it ever did in a modern American hospital. She had left that life behind after a devastating loss, a mentor and close friend, another surgeon on her team, killed in a mortar strike that Angela herself had narrowly survived, and had returned to the United States carrying a grief so heavy that she had, quietly and deliberately, stepped away from the operating table as a surgeon altogether, retraining instead as a scrub nurse, choosing a role that let her remain close to the work she loved, without carrying the full, crushing weight of final responsibility for a life in her hands. For over 20 years, she had kept that history carefully private, telling almost no one at Sacred Heart the fuller truth of who she had once been, content instead to support the surgeons around her quietly, faithfully, quietly saving lives from just one careful step removed from the front line. Exactly the distance she had needed, all those years ago, to keep functioning at all. But on that particular winter night, with 5 lives hanging in the balance and no one else available to save them, the old instincts, the ones she had spent 2 decades carefully setting aside, rose up in her hands without hesitation, exactly the way her grandmother, back in the small Georgia town where Angela had grown up, used to say instincts always eventually would. The hands remember what the heart decides. Her grandmother had told her long ago, on a porch swing during a humid summer evening, decide to help, and the hands will find their way back to it, no matter how long you've kept them still. Rachel Ferris survived. So did the elderly man, Walter Higgins, whom Angela moved to next, guiding a visibly shaken but rapidly learning. Dr. Kavanaugh through a delicate abdominal repair with the same calm, exacting authority she had shown throughout the night. So eventually did the teenage boy and the second young woman, each surgery completed in the careful, unhurried sequence that only someone with Angela's particular, hard-won experience could have managed. Alone, in the gap left by a hospital simply not staffed for the scale of that night's crisis. By the time the sun rose over Sacred Heart Regional Hospital, all 5 patients from the highway accident were stable, resting in recovery, their families gathered in quiet, grateful clusters in the hospital's waiting areas, unaware of just how much the night's outcome had depended on the quiet woman who had, for over 2 decades, simply been known as Angela from the OR. Dr. Kavanaugh found her afterward in the small break room down the hall, a cup of vending machine coffee cooling in her hands. Exhaustion settled deep into her shoulders in the particular way that comes only after a night spent, holding everything together for the sake of people who would never fully know what it had cost her. I have about 100 questions, he said, sitting down across from her. Angela smiled, tired but genuine. I imagine you do. 22 years, Kavanaugh said. 22 years working beside you, and I had no idea you were a trauma surgeon before you ever came to Sacred Heart. It wasn't something I talked about, Angela said quietly. It belonged to a different chapter of my life, a harder one. I came back from West Africa carrying more grief than I knew how to hold, and I found that stepping back from the table, supporting, instead of leading, let me stay close to the work I loved, without the weight of it crushing me the way it nearly had before. But tonight you led anyway, Kavanaugh said gently. You didn't hesitate. There wasn't room to hesitate, Angela said. 5 lives don't wait for a person to work through their own old grief. Sometimes you set the weight down for 20 years, and then a night comes along that asks you to pick it back up again, whether you feel ready or not. You just do the work in front of you, and you let the rest sort itself out afterward. Kavanaugh was quiet for a long moment, turning his own coffee cup slowly in his hands. I owe you an apology, I think. All these years, I thought of you as an excellent scrub nurse, which you are, but I never once thought to wonder what else you might be underneath that. I never asked. Most people don't, Angela said. Without bitterness, only the quiet, settled peace of someone who had made her own careful, peace with being underestimated. It's all right. I chose the quiet path for my own reasons. I'm not owed anyone's curiosity just because I was hiding something worth asking about. Still, Kavanaugh said, thank you. Tonight, and for every night before it that I never fully appreciated. Word of what had happened that winter night moved through Sacred Heart Regional Hospital, the way such stories always do, quietly at first, in the hushed exchanges of shift change and then more openly, until within a matter of weeks. Nearly every member of the surgical staff had heard some version of the story of the scrub nurse who had once been a war surgeon, who had broken every rule of hospital protocol on a single desperate night, and who had saved 5 lives doing it. The hospital's administration, initially uncertain how to categorize what had happened. A nurse operating in a surgeon's role fell so far outside standard policy that nobody was quite sure what precedent applied. Eventually, convened a quiet review. at the end of which Angela was neither reprimanded nor quietly dismissed, but instead offered something she had not expected at all, an invitation to return, formally to surgical practice, her old credentials reinstated after a careful review of her original training and licensure. She considered the offer for nearly a month before declining it, gently, with the same calm clarity she brought to everything. "I appreciate it," she told the hospital's chief of surgery, an older woman named Dr. Patricia Vance, who had overseen the review personally. "But I think I've found the place I'm meant to be. I can still do the work that matters from where I stand. I don't need to be the one holding the scalpel every single time to know I'm helping. You could save more lives as a surgeon," Vance pointed out. "Directly, I mean." "I've saved plenty of lives from where I stand," Angela said. "Just from one careful step back. I think after everything, that's exactly the distance I need to keep doing this work well, for as long as I've still got years left to give it. There is a particular kind of wisdom that comes only from having carried something heavy for a very long time, and having learned gradually exactly how much of that weight a person can set down, and how much must simply be carried forward, quietly for the whole rest of a life. Angela Whitmore had learned that lesson in the hardest possible circumstances, intense lit-by-generator light on the other side of the world, and she had spent over 20 years afterward finding her own quiet, steady way of honoring that lesson without ever needing anyone else to fully understand it. She continued at Sacred Heart Regional for another decade after that winter night, training young surgeons in the quiet, unspoken rhythms of the operating room, her reputation among her colleagues subtly but permanently altered. Not because she had changed, but because they had finally glimpsed the fuller depth of the woman who had been standing quietly beside them all along. Young surgeons who trained under her in those later years sometimes asked carefully about the story they had heard, the night she had scrubbed in as lead and saved 5 lives in a single desperate shift, and Angela would answer them, when she chose to answer at all, with the same simple wisdom her grandmother had once offered her on a porch swing in rural Georgia, decades before any of them were born. "You don't need to know everything about a person to trust their hands," she would tell them. "Sometimes the quietest person in the room has carried the heaviest things and simply chosen not to make a show of it. Pay attention to the people who show up faithfully, again and again, without asking for recognition. Those are usually the ones worth learning from." And on quiet evenings, long after her shifts had ended, Angela Whitmore would sometimes sit on her own back porch, coffee cooling in her hands, thinking of a mentor she had lost decades earlier in a tent far from home, and of the 5 lives she had carried safely through one impossible winter night at Sacred Heart, and she would feel, in that stillness, the particular peace of a woman who had finally, fully made her peace with every chapter of the life she had lived. The surgeon she had been, the nurse she had become, and the quiet, steady wisdom that had carried her faithfully through both.